Hello there, and welcome to Preprints in Motion, the podcast taking a deep dive in the fast-paced world of preprints.
Join us as we sit down with early career researchers, discuss their latest preprint, and find out about their journey through the muddy marshes of academia.
Hit that subscribe button, leave a rating, and support us by heading over to buymeacoffee.com/preprints. But for now, let's get into the show.
Today we're stepping away from publications and instead looking at a process that happens much earlier on, hardware. We're talking to Jason Griffey from the Open Science Hardware Foundation. This actually is something I've been wanting to do for a while because, at least in my circles, we don't really talk about hardware very often when it comes to open science. And I suspect a lot of the people listening will know open science as this publishing thing and open software, open code maybe, but I doubt that many people listening will actually know about hardware. And also, actually, when we first started this podcast, our first ever episode was about a Lego microscope, which is open science hardware.
Oh, lovely.
So
no, it's great,
we accidentally started with the hardware. And so this is why I'm excited to actually talk to you, because this is a really good opportunity to talk about something that I feel is not talked about enough. But I guess to start, could you actually just explain what open science hardware is?
Sure, absolutely. I agree with you. One of the reasons that I'm excited about this sort of effort and the foundation is that the open science movement, which has been obviously around for a long while, is normally understood as a sort of publishing movement, right? Whether that's publication of outputs, papers, etc., or whether that's publication of data, or as you said, occasionally it's publication of code, right? But underlying all of that in the scientific endeavor is like, how do you collect the data? How do you, look at the things? How do you, there's a whole layer of hardware in the middle of all of this research process that often is just understood as some sort of neutral entity, some sort of like, it's just seen as a background to the sort of science that goes on. But I mean, in actuality, right, like scientific instruments typically are proprietary. They have their own limitations. You're only allowed to use them in certain ways, or they only collect or do things in very specific ways. And I think my perspective and the perspective of the people that I work with is that the hardware itself also needs to be part of this open endeavor, that being unable to interrogate the hardware in a real way is a problem in trying to verify results, trying to just keep science moving. I mean, there are sort of very practical reasons to have open hardware that involve things like repairability and things like supply chains being interrupted and being unable to get parts. There's like a lot of very practical kinds of things. There's also sort of equity issues in that proprietary hardware is more expensive by orders of magnitude than open hardware, and that the sort of having hardware be open and described and understood and available for modification and all of those allows for science to be much more equitable and available to people around the world. So there's lots of layers of why sort of hardware, why I think and, can explain why hardware should be open. But I, as you said, I think that the very first step is just making people aware that it's an issue, that it is not open, and trying to sort of in the parts of the research process where instrumentation is important, having that be questioned. Just say, like, what are we using? What could we use? What are the sort of options for us in this particular, piece of the research process? And is it possible to use open rather than proprietary hardware? So that it's awareness and questioning, and that's sort of my first step when I'm talking to people who don't quite think about hardware. Is like, well, let's start there. Let's start questioning what it is we're using. Let's start thinking about whether or not there are options, that sort of thing.
Most of our listeners have got a life science background, so they'll be very familiar with insanely expensive pieces of hardware. And those that run labs really will know the pain of trying to find £250,000 for a microscope, or a microscope part in some cases. The thing that always scared me, so my background's very microscopy heavy, and whenever you're getting trained on a new microscope, people love to tell you how much individual bits cost, so just in case you break them. And
exactly.
Knowing you're paying with you've got a lens, and the single lens can cost like £60,000. Just the lens. And if you break that's a lot of money. But I think that with that microscopy side as well, and just because of my background, I think a lot of listeners have that kind of background as well. I think a lot of microscopists actually are a bit more familiar with the hardware side, because you do, especially if you run a facility, right? Microscopists like to get their hands on, and they'll 3D print bits, they'll create bits, and I think a microscope is a lot like Lego when you actually get around to it, because you tend to build them yourselves. It's quite cool. But other lab stuff is not that at all. I said our first episode was the Lego microscope, but when you're thinking about sequencing, when you're thinking about mass spec, for example, one of the things that comes up a lot in conversations I have with people in the global south is that they're terrified to put their work out as a preprint or open source, open access, because they don't have access to these kind of machines because they're too expensive and a bunch of other reasons. This is one of the things I think is really cool about open science hardware, is that it kind of fills that gap a little bit. But in that vein, who do you think benefits the most from that? Is it researchers, or is it society? Who really benefits from hardware being open?
I think it's all of the above. I think your examples they're spot on, right? The lack of available hardware, affordable hardware, and also just the lack of sort of supply chains and being able to get their hands on things in some cases, right? All of those things limit not only the kinds of science that are possible, right? Like that in certain spaces, if you don't have a particular piece of hardware, you just can't do a specific thing, right? It also limits reproducibility, right? It limits the number of people in the sort of scientific community that can go back and attempt to test a particular thing or reproduce a particular outcome, right? Citizen science, the sort of idea that science should be able to be done by, the broad citizenry as a part of being responsible members of society, and again, raising the social good in general, I think is also very strong. Being able to have hardware that is capable of doing sort of these scientific inquiries in areas where it's missing just generally helps the world. It doesn't, I don't think it's generalizable to just more science is better, although I would think that it is. Personally, more science, always fan. But the equity that's available for affordable science is also, just runs through culture, it runs through society, it runs through the research that the research outputs, it runs through sort of every level of what we'd like to see in the world.
Do you have any tangible good examples of particular bits of hardware that were made open and why that was a good thing? Because my favorite is the seatbelt. I think that's an amazing one.
The seatbelt, the 3-point seatbelt is one of the best examples. I think I'm going to agree with you there. The availability of the 3-point seatbelt to the world was one of those great, could it have been monetized? Sure. Could it have been proprietary? Absolutely, right? It was an innovation that was patentable in at least most countries in the world. But the inventor said, you know what? This is actually really important for public safety, and this is going to literally save lives. And it did, right? Over the course of decades, it saved millions and millions of lives. So that's a fantastic example, right? I think there's one of the things I'm excited about. So I'm new-ish in this particular world. I'm actually the executive director of the Open Science Hardware Foundation, and have only been so for sort of new-ish in the position. But one of the things that I'm very excited about is that next year, 2026, is actually the 10th anniversary of the progenitor organization, the Gathering of Open Science Hardware, that led to the foundation that I'm currently the executive director of. And as a part of that 10th anniversary, we're going to be highlighting and celebrating some of the sort of most important, most interesting, biggest projects that have come out of this particular world over the last 10 years. So one of the things I'll say is watch our website, because we're going to be highlighting what we think are some of the most interesting projects that have become open and that have sort of spread around the world and helped science and culture and in general. A lot of those are, microscopy obviously is one piece of science, but a lot of our work tends to be citizen science stuff that is involved in ecology or ecological measurements, things like biodiversity measurements or things like that. So there's some really interesting stories that come from that world. And those will be rolling out over the course of the next several months. So I look forward to kind of putting that out into the world.
I mean, that actually probably leads quite nicely into what I was thinking of next, which is, one of the big benefits is that open hardware means things are equitable, but one of the big problems, certainly with open science, is that it's not actually that equitable, because a lot of the ideas come from America and Western Europe, and they're kind of forced on everyone else. So how do you, broadly, but also as an organization, ensure that when you're creating open science hardware, when you're discussing about these things, it's not just created in these wealthy countries and then distributed, but how do you co-create globally? And I think ecology actually is probably a good way into that, I imagine.
Yeah. It's certainly one of the, ecology and climate change go hand in hand these days, as far as the measurements and outcomes and publications and stuff. And that is of interest to everyone right now, right? That's it is not just a rich country sort of issue, right? Everyone broadly is trying very hard to understand what's going on in their locales and in their spaces. So one of the things that the Open Science Hardware Foundation tries very hard to do is to help in the creation of hardware. I'll back up a little bit and just say, so creating hardware is hard. Creating a prototype is not that hard, but scaling is hard, and growing distribution, manufacturing, sort of as projects get more popular, those pieces are really hard, especially because the people who are prototyping are, generally speaking, the scientists that are interested in the inquiry, and scientists are not manufacturing experts. That's not their core competency, nor should it be. Shouldn't have to be their core competency. And so, one of the places where OSHF can hopefully help is in that sort of, providing standards, providing guidance, providing pathways for these projects to make it easier to make broader impacts, to be able to help them find partners, to help them find funding for scaling their projects up. So that hopefully is a little bit of a sort of an equity thing that we can help with. That way you don't just have sort of pre-resourced institutes being able to scale things. We can operate as a partner with people who, there may be a scientist somewhere who built a prototype and they're like, well, this would be, really important in my community, but I don't have the resources to, get it out, to make more of them in a way that makes a difference, right? In my country, in my state, in my wherever, whatever the scope is that they're looking for. And in those cases, Open Science Hardware Foundation can act as a fiscal sponsor for ongoing grant. They can help connect them potentially with other people in the scientific community who are doing similar work, so that they, you can combine efforts and help in that way. So, my goal is hopefully to build a community that can help support these sorts of projects, both fiscally, but also in just knowing what it means to scale something, knowing what it means to be able to do small batch manufacturing, with quality checks such that they can be used in the field for scientific measurement. All of those issues are things that, again, the scientists aren't expected to be experts in, but we can hopefully partner with and help them in those spaces where those needs occur.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure no scientist wants another full-time job in manufacturing.
No, they do not. No, they do not.
So stepping back broad open science, one of the things Open Science wants to do is have open licenses. And whenever I talk about licenses with researchers when they're publishing, they don't understand why a certain license is better than another, what they're doing by choosing a particular license. And so generally they opt for closed because they understand closed. I would imagine with hardware, we've already talked about, hardware you can patent, you can make money off of hardware. You can't, you can, but it's a lot harder to make money off a paper you've randomly published. You're usually paying them to publish. So how do you get around that kind of barrier? Because, so the previous executive director of ASAP Bioware used to work. Jessica moved to Astera, and they were doing work with people who were coming up with all kinds of things. Some of that was hardware stuff, some of it was software. And one of the things they run into as a problem is people want to make money from it. And how do you embed those good open science principles into that? And how do you get over that kind of barrier? Hardware, it sounds like that would be an even bigger barrier to navigate.
Yeah, I have found that in the work that I've done in the past. It is definitely there seems to be, even though it is not intellectually defensible, people do have a sort of natural a natural inclination to believe that physical things are more valuable than intellectual things, right? That in somehow there's an intrinsic worth to a physical thing, that you build it and, the parts cost some amount and like it's clever in some way. There's some idea there. And then, you put that out into the world, and people do have a sort of natural inclination to believe that that's, there's a value there that's created in that physical object. And it's not true that there has to be some funding / physical value there, because parts do cost things. Like, if you need a custom PCB for a particular sensor, like there's money involved in that. And, you have to pay someone to make it for you, and then you have to package it, or you have, there's certain things that you just can't get around. None of that particular aspect of it is free. And so, that does lend itself into a sort of a different economy than, again, not that papers and intellectual endeavors aren't valuable, because intellectual property is a phrase for a reason, but we don't, as a culture, especially sort of Western culture, doesn't typically assign the same sort of intrinsic value to those things. And so when you're talking to a scientist, or we're talking to someone who who's working in a space where they've developed some sensor, or they've developed something that they want to use more broadly, you end up talking a lot in metaphor. right? You end up doing a lot of sort of comparative metaphors. One of the key sort of ends in that space, from my perspective, tends to be that if someone is building, if someone has gotten to the point where they have an idea for a significant hardware piece, they have probably thought about the software, because almost none of these aren't digital in some way these days, right? Like there's a microcontroller, there's something going on digitally so that there's software involved. Very few of them are like electromechanical right now. They're not, they're going to have some sort of, even if it's a very, very minimal digital brain, they're going to have some kind of programmable microchip in there somewhere. And if you've got that, you've got open source, and you've got the software piece that has to go on it, and the hardware's no good without the software. And so those are kind of intrinsically tied together in a way that gives you an in, right? When you're talking to someone about it, you can talk to them about the code and making the code open and making sure that, the code's available for people to security check and all of the other sorts of things that we talk about when we talk about open source. And once you get there, you can say, well, the code is really useless without the hardware. It's written to the hardware typically. And so is there any harm in sort of going that one next step and making it sort of much more fully available, much more fully described, much more, and it doesn't always work. I mean, I've had these discussions with people where they aren't capable of sort of making that next leap for one reason or another, but it often, my conversations in general, they tend to follow that train of logic to the end, right? You once you sort of start down those tracks, it's a little easier to come to the conclusion. Yeah, it would be. We're building a thing. We want it to be used. The world, can't really do it without the whole package, and so let's go ahead and work towards making those things as open as we can.
Yeah. So one of the things we found with getting people to adopt preprinting in particular was having, like a repository of here's a bunch of people who've already done it, here's the things you get from it, all kind of stuff. And I'm asking slightly selfishly here, because now I'm thinking I should do a video about the seatbelt, but is there a repository of open science hardware examples that people can go and say, actually, well, this is something someone's done that's open science hardware, and these are all the impacts it had, this is why it was a great thing?
Yeah, that's on my to-do list, actually. That's one of the things that I'm hoping to put together in the next year. We, as a part of this 10th anniversary celebration of the community that we're moving forward with for 26, that part of that is going to be collecting the case studies and really putting together. There are some papers where that sort of thing has been done, but it's been not quite as. I mean, that, as you well know, dealing with research, just because something is in a paper doesn't mean it's discoverable and findable and cross-referential and all of those things. So trying to put all of that into a form that on our website that is searchable and easy to sort of see the comparisons and stuff. That's something I'm going to be hopefully putting together. This year. There are, I will say, other groups that work in open hardware, sort of outside necessarily the science framework. The Open Source Hardware Association, OSHWA, has a really thorough website. They actually have been at it for a while, and they do sort of generalized open hardware. It's not in the sort of scientific bent. They have literally anything you can imagine, from toys to, just all over the place. But we're going to be obviously concentrating on the sort of very specific science aspect of the hardware that we've supported or that we're aware of.
And are you seeing any shifts with policy level stuff around hardware? So, governments, funders, because this is certainly open science more broadly, there is now a shift in that way, but I'm not sure if that's happening with hardware or not.
It is. As a part of I think the biggest one is the UNESCO Open Science framework that was published last year.
Yeah, I
Something
think,
like
yeah.
that. I think that's right. Or
I
maybe
think
it was
that's
updated originally earlier in the 20s and then maybe updated. But if I have my dates wrong, apologies. But that specifically, the UNESCO Open Science Framework specifically calls out hardware as one of the aspects that should be paid attention to when open science is on the table, right? And so that's probably the largest of those very firm policy statements that are out in the world. Unsurprisingly, I think the EU is much farther ahead in general with open science, but also sort of understanding that open science hardware is a thing that should be paid attention to. The sort of idea in the EU of digital sovereignty and being sort of free of attachment to other areas of the world, right? In the research process, making sure that things are being able to be done without sort of connection necessarily to the U.S. or to China or other geopolitical actors. The open hardware is certainly a part of those discussions, trying to make sure that there's not a requirement for a specific hardware from a specific place. One of the big areas right now, obviously, is AI and the sort of NVIDIA overwhelming chip requirement for sort of large-scale AI use. I know that there's some discussions, not necessarily just obviously in the scientific aspect, because that's everywhere these days, but that's a thing that's being talked about in a variety of places, right? From a policy standpoint. So, my experience has been that the most of the very forward-thinking, really, what I would consider quite solid policy work is being done. The EU, the EC, the UN, these large-scale policy talks. One of the things that I'm trying to do, in my position and with the foundation, is to sort of take those discussions down to the funder level and to the research unit level, and trying to get those expectations and the expectations for open hardware embedded both sort of, in the sort of funding streams, so that when a funder goes to a research unit and says, here's a grant, but we're going to ask you to, make sure that your hardware is as open as it can possibly be, and here are the reasons. And then obviously farther down to the research unit, the university level, etc., and say, in those spaces, the expectation, for tenure, promotion, etc., there's a lot of open science, open access expectations there now. Getting hardware to be a part of those conversations is something else that obviously I would love to be involved in. That's something that I'm trying to actively do.
Yeah, that's certainly 2026, 27, probably a bit beyond that as well. That is the big focus, I think, for open science broadly, is that recognition reward side of it. Although I do think that does negate a little bit, depends how it's being done. I've got a bit of a skewed perspective at the moment because of how my year's been, but I think there is a... See, this is one of those things we might have to remove. Certainly the preprint space has kind of shifted away from the grassroots doing a good thing, and I suspect in some quarters now on the track of just creating another journal and actually not making any real change. So I think there's a little bit of a danger going on in the open science space at the moment. But at the time of recording, at least, the big news is the Centre for Open Science have just began to establish a base in Europe. And I think this is a really good thing, because again, one of the things I've been calling for like 2 years now, to no avail, is that the US needs to shift their focus. A lot of the US open science stuff needs to shift their focus to the EU, because I'm in the UK, so I can still pretend I'm part of Europe. I wish we were. The EU has been ahead for quite a few years now on all this stuff, and I think the US is, I don't know if it's just people are very mindset that this was a thing where it was all ahead and it was a great place to do it all, and so they kind of haven't shifted for that reason or something else. But it's nice to see that shift. Have you, while we're on the US, have you been impacted by the current ridiculousness that's going on in the funding landscape, the political landscape? How's that impacting the hardware side?
Yeah. So I haven't seen a overwhelming effect yet. But that is not to say that I don't expect there to be, or that it isn't incredibly worrisome, right? That variability, I'm trying not to be overly negative, but my goodness, that's a linguistic challenge.
Yeah, we've been very negative so far on the podcast, so it's okay.
Yeah. It is definitely the variability and just whimsy of the tariff situations on hardware in the US, on, availability of just things, chips, board, hardware, digital hardware specifically, is incredibly worrisome, right? Nothing is as disruptive to a hardware situation when a particular piece you need is just gone. And so it is worrisome from my perspective. There are far too, it's not a thing that we should have to worry about. There should be open and active trade, responsibly between globally interested partners, and the fact that there even has to be a consideration that, we need to think about where this particular thing is coming from because it might be on the naughty list next month. It's a very difficult situation to try and navigate. And so I haven't seen it really smack anyone yet, but it is almost certainly because I just haven't been made aware of it, or it hasn't, it is nascent but not active yet, right? And I think a lot of people have been worried about it.
It does feel like with the hardware side, you've got a slightly different bent to it all, because it is more about the sort of political whimsy and the tariff side, whereas the rest of science is just hit by the craziness going on at the NIH. And
it's the funding and the variability of grant, availability, and
And I had the misfortune of meeting some of the people now destroying US science, and they're very narrowly focused. So I think in some ways that's good for hardware and software and all that kind of stuff, because they're very focused on health, because they think that's their background, even though none of them are actual real doctors. And so I think there's a bit of shielding in that aspect. Sadly, not for everyone else.
I think so. Although I will say, to be a nonprofit in the U.S. at this particular point in time is a particularly terrifying minefield of everything. So we're, I think a lot of us in the nonprofit space are trying to continue doing aggressive good work, and just watching to see how long and what might be barriers that we have to work ourselves around.
Yeah, I think this is one of the things people outside the US have not quite understood fully yet, is how challenging that is to navigate, because you can lose your non-profit status at just anyone's whimsy at the moment, and it is happening
at a whim. Yep, it is indeed. So, yep, that is an ongoing active concern, but not a threat that I've had to seriously consider. So.
Which is good. Let's get back to positive. We should have probably started this episode with a big congratulations to you for being new in the role.
Thank you.
Let's switch up and let's talk about you a little bit. So could you talk a little bit about what led you to the foundation and sort of what your background is?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I I always try to say, I think the most interesting people I know have really odd and unusual backgrounds, and so my background being odd and unusual should make me less unsure of myself than it does. But I do have an odd and unusual background. So academically, my background is varied between biology, philosophy, and information science. So my undergraduate sort of training was in biology, and then I went off and did a master's work and a little bit of PhD work that was a massive failure in philosophy of science. So I was very interested in sort of how science works and how what the ideas of science mean in sort of a grand epistemological sense, and how it all sort of fits together philosophically. And so I did master's and a little bit of PhD work in sort of that space, and then realized that there were no jobs in philosophy, and why, that's not a thing that actually I could move on in. And ended up going and getting a master's in information science, library and information science. And I actually worked as an academic librarian for a number of years in the sort of library research technology space. My background is heavy in technology, both hardware and software. I've done a number of things in technology over the years, especially in the sort of library and information space. And so, I've got this swirl of science and information and technology and philosophy to some degree sort of all rolling around. And when my immediate previous position before coming on board with the Open Science Hardware Foundation was with the National Information Standards Organization here in the U.S., where I was working with them to do things like trying to develop responsible publishing standards in a world of AI, right? And what sort of research metadata needs to be involved in a publishing process when we're in a world of generative AI and things like that. So, I was in sort of the research space doing standards work at a very high level. And this position I was unaware that something so interesting existed in the world. It called out to me in a really sort of very visceral way. I have been a part of two different, launched two different hardware projects in the library space. One of them was called Library Box, which was, this was in 2012, so quite a while back, but which was an offline internet resource, sort of a mobile library that you could take anywhere you wanted and let people access. And then a second one was a project called Measure the Future, which was a computer vision-based machine learning tool that attempted to try to understand what people were doing in physical spaces, trying to understand sort of attention metrics in physical spaces for places like libraries and museums. So I had a background, I've got a basement full of 3D printers and a laser cutter with an electronics bench, my background lends itself to a sort of creation of things. And then the sort of high-end policy stuff that I've done over the course of my career all came together in this position. And I was so thrilled to be able to interview for it. And then, being able to be the inaugural executive director of the foundation was something that just seemed like a wonderful opportunity to take all of my interests and put them together put my shoulder behind sort of the progress of science, which is something I feel just incredibly strongly about. It's one of the things that I think is most important in the world, and to be able to sort of be a part of that endeavor writ large is something that really excites me.
I think that's exactly what you need in someone running this kind of organization as well. You need someone who's got the background so they understand it and has all the excitement and passion to push it forward.
I hope so. I certainly hope so.
So what are the priorities for the foundation over the next couple of years? Because the website's got a really cool list of all the priority programs, and they look really good and exciting stuff that's coming up. But what are your big priorities, I guess, for the foundation?
Yeah. I mean, there's a number. I mean, a large part. I'm really excited to start to more aggressively tell the story of open hardware. Honestly, the as you said, sort of near the top of the show here, that it's a part of the research endeavor in science that is just generally not people are just not aware of it. It's a blind spot, and so part of the next 12 to 18 months is going to be doing my best to raise the attention level. Just make people aware of it as broadly and as widely as we possibly can. Do that through the highlighting of previous successes, right? But also in trying to set a more aggressive mission and vision for the organization, try to get as many partnerships in place as I can. I'm hoping to be able to work with, you mentioned the Center for Open Science. There are a number of open infrastructure groups. There are, one of the sort of cool things about open hardware is that not only is it obviously sort of the internal research groups that I can work with, but also like Adafruit and SparkFun and some of the sort of hobbyist maker spaces that are involved in hardware creation. Bringing some of those maker communities into the science world is something that I'm super excited about trying to do. So a lot of outreach and connection and a lot of sort of connecting communities is very, very high on my list, right? Very high on my list. And then the other piece, so that's like awareness. The other piece is trying to have actual, policy successes, working with the UN, working with, as much as possible here in the U.S., working with organizations that are like-minded to try and influence policy as much as we can. We had the Nelson Memo here in the U.S., which was a memorandum from the federal government that insisted on a timeline for open publication of any U.S. government-funded research, right? It has largely it's very vague now, as many things are in the U.S. It's very vague how and what the status of that is, and so trying to work with other organizations to try to find clarity on what those funding requirements are, and then try to make sure that hardware is a piece of those policy discussions. So trying to make sure that we can strike while the iron is hot on, sort of both internet, from my perspective, international, right, the EU and elsewhere, but also here internally as well. So those are my two largest concerns. You sort of making as much noise as I can about how good and cool the work that has been done is, and then trying to find a space for the policy to really help the future of the hardware space in science be something that's central to the sort of scientific research endeavor. So,
and that two-pronged approach. So I've been doing advocacy stuff for like 8 years now, I think, and that's exactly what you need. You need that grassroots, get everyone excited to do it, but you need the top left down sort of incentive aspect right alongside it. You can't really, if you try and do one of those without the other, it just doesn't seem to work very well.
It's much harder, and it certainly moves much slower if you don't sort of get both together. And so, yeah, that's those two pieces are going to be my focus for the next 12 to 18 months, trying to make sure that we move forward responsibly on the policy front and excitedly on the sort of grassroots community front, right?
How do you? So that's a big wide group of people who are very different from one another. Navigating just one of those groups is actually quite challenging. And advocacy. The thing I tell people when I'm training them or doing any of the teaching around advocacy is that advocacy isn't about anything other than building a good relationship with a person. It's one person at a time. You have a really good relationship, and that person will do pretty much whatever you want them to do. It's a little bit culty, but it works. That's how you do it well. But when you've got all these different groups, you're setting yourself a very big challenge of navigating all of that. How do you sort of plan to do that? How do you plan to approach that?
Yeah, that's an ongoing bit of planning, right? It is in large part finding the people who are the bridges between the spaces. Part of I have a long history in sort of the research publication space and a lot of knowledge about science, but I don't yet know all of the players in the bridging between these places. And so definitely the next 3 months are a fire hose of making connections and finding people who want to chat and finding those nexus points where things come together, and the people that can act as connectors and bridges, so that when I start making connections, I can make sure that those people are in the rooms where those things are being talked about, and can help those communication challenges. You're right. It's very hard. It's very, very hard. That's at one point, in the process of interviewing and being hired, I said to the board, all of it is hard, but people are hard. Like that's the hardest piece, is the building community, maintaining community, and connecting communities. That's always the hardest piece of any of this work. And so finding the people that are able to help in those spaces is like job number one for me in the next little bit. We're very excited. I'm very excited, I'll say. The OSHF is organizing a meeting early in 2026 where we're bringing a lot of decision makers together, and I'm hoping that's a nucleus point for some fun, exciting things to grow. And so we're starting that work now, and I'm hoping that's the seed that gets these connections sort of moving.
Yeah. I mean, that's the thing that, again, with the preprint space has been really successful, is just bringing people together and not trying to tell them what to do, but just empower them to do whatever it is they're doing. It seems to work really well. We just had the last ever, sadly, CZI Open Science meeting this year. And that, for a few years now, has been really good at bringing all those kind of groups together. Now they're not doing anymore. Just the US is a mess.
It is.
But,
yes.
But there's a new chapter somewhere, maybe. But yeah, I think that it's nice to hear that kind of approach going on, because it is something I think is really super important anyway. One of the things with this kind of community is hardware, and software as well, really, is quite decentralized. There is a lot of grassroots work going on. There are a lot of people with quite strong opinions. You get people, certainly these kind of things, you get people who are everything should be open, everything, it's just completely open and free. Some people are a little bit behind that, and it should be as open as possible. And then you've got people who, it's what I want, and that's whatever that is will happen. What does, talking about community, what does leadership of a community look like when it's so decentralized? How do you kind of build those bridges and those nexuses?
Yeah, having been in open source and some open hardware, but a lot of open source spaces over the last couple of decades in my life, you've definitely nailed it. There are in those spaces, there are people with very strongly held beliefs, and trying to find consensus is sort of a primary challenge. I wouldn't say, you used a word leading. I am not going to use top-down words when it comes to communities like this, because I don't think it's useful to think about, sort of any like real leadership, right? It's much more about building consensus, and much more about finding spaces where people agree to such a point where the disagreements aren't as important as the agreements, right? That in the standards world, in the world of developing standards, the especially national and international sort of informational standards, there is zero chance that everyone is going to be happy. That's just not a possibility. I was a part of committees where we had librarians, researchers, and publishers all trying to come together and decide on a particular way of doing something. And those groups have extremely different ideas about how publishing should work. And who, rights and authorship, and there's just all sorts of things that they fundamentally disagree on. But if you get them in a room together, you find the areas where they do agree, and then you build from those agreements. That's where you can actually get some forward progress on things. And so in the standards world, we have I don't know whether this is popular anywhere else, but in the standards world, we had a phrase that was effectively consensus is the lack of sustained disagreement. So, like you get to a point where everyone is willing to move forward with the thing, even if they have concerns and stuff. And often in contentious communities, that particular tactic is extremely useful. You find the areas where everyone agrees, and then you build your scaffolding from there, whatever that is, and whether that's policy or whether that's practice. You can often find those. And so that's, from a strategy point of view, that's often my strategy for interacting in those spaces where there's contention about license or contention about particular policy outcomes or things like that. You find the areas of agreement, and then you work from there.
Yeah, I don't know why this has popped into my head, but if anyone watches The Crown, there's a scene in there where Margaret Thatcher is at a big political conference thing, and all these leaders across the world are trying to get her to sign a document, and she's arguing over like a single word, and it's just this back and forth of this one word until eventually she agrees to a compromise that works out. But that's how I imagine a lot of these kind of discussions actually end up going. It is you do get kind of caught up on very, very narrow things that often aren't actually that important, really. Okay, so as a nice ending question, if you could look ahead to like 10 years for the open hardware community, what would you like to see in 10 years' time with that community?
Oh, man. I think that's a great question. I would really love to see... So there's a couple of things. One would be, I would love to see open hardware be a expected part of research, right? Of scientific research. That it was the idea that the equipment that we use should be just as open and just as available for inquiry into as the data that is produced, or the stats that are presented in a paper, or whatever the aspect of that particular science is, that the hardware and the code that makes the hardware up should be just as questionable. Right? We should be able to inquire as to it and how it works and what happens in the same way that we do with the data. So I would love that. I would love for that to be done through funding requirements. I would love for grant funders to say, that's part of our deal. Your data has to be open. your publication has to be open, and your hardware has to be open, right? And then I would love personally to see science be much more equitable and available around the world. And so that's part of the, sort of general sweep of open science. That is normally, and you can feel free to correct me or disagree with me, but that has normally been focused on the outputs, right? That everyone is deserving of the outputs of the scientific endeavor. And I absolutely agree with that, but I also think that science would be better and richer if there were more available inputs as well. And so open hardware and open science hardware is a way in to more equitable inputs in science. And I think that's an incredibly important thing. So I would love to see that be a sort of, available resource for the world in 10 years. More of that, whether that's sensors, whether that's microscopes, whether that's, whatever. In 10 years, it might be open hardware, AI stacks doing, data collection, interpretation of whatever, telescopes pointed at the sky or whatever. But that equity for inputs, I think, is incredibly important. I think we would be a better culture and society if we had more of that. So
yeah, that's talking to people from the global south, one of the things they're most unhappy with is that input end. They're not part of these discussions to begin with. There's a few things come out this year, articles where that have highlighted this a little bit, but people who are doing research with people in the global south, those global south researchers are actually there to do this, like the busy work oftentimes, or provide the avenue to the local community instead of being like the central point of designing these kind of studies. And that always bothers me. And I think that is, the discussions are happening, so it is starting to shift, but that I would love to see that as a big shift. All right, we'll call it there because I've had you for an hour. But thank you so much. That was I've learned loads. That's what we aim for. And one day I'm going to get all those people who say that was great and that was a great question. I'm going to just cut all that into one big episode one day, just for my ego.
And that's the show, folks. If you enjoyed listening, then hit that subscribe button to get the latest updates straight to wherever it is you're listening. Don't forget to rate us on Spotify. Until next time, have a good week.
This podcast was produced by Rippling Ideas, turning ideas into waves.